Before going into George Harrison's solo albums, I think it's best to go back all the way to the beginning. George Harrison was born on February 25th, 1943, in a small house in Liverpool. You know what, never mind, I'm not going to go that far back. George Harrison's main role in the Beatles was the lead guitar player, also that important third harmony with John Lennon and Paul McCartney, and usually singing one or two songs per album, either one by Lennon and McCartney or covers by Chuck Berry or Carl Perkins.
I don't really like to be the guy in the white suit at the front, so I was the one who kept quiet and at the back and let the other egos be at the front.
The first song he ever wrote for the group was on Meet the Beatles, or With the Beatles, depending on which side of the Atlantic you were on, and it was called Don't Bother Me. I've actually always liked this number. It's a bit of a darker vibe, almost like a precursor to grunge, which is actually what everybody was listening to at the time I first heard this record. It was even featured for a brief moment in A Hard Day's Night, their first film. Their second film, Help, featured a performance of his second song, I Need You. This is where you really hear the roots of his signature sound starting to emerge. Rubber Soul was the album where he really established himself as a songwriting contender.
You know, at that time, I think that was the best one we'd made.
He had two solid numbers among a formidable track listing by Lennon and McCartney. These included Think for Yourself, and one of my absolute favorite Beatles songs, If I Needed Someone.
If I needed someone.
With its memorable guitar riff and classic Beatle harmonies, it is an essential track. On Revolver, 3 of his songs were showcased. In fact, Taxman kicks the album off in funky fashion. Even though he was the de facto lead guitarist of the band, George didn't play a lot of guitar solos in his own songs. In fact, the guitar solo in Taxman is actually played by Paul, and a pretty cool solo at that. Another standout track was I Want to Tell You, similar to If I Needed Someone with a cool guitar line and harmonies. But the track Love You Too was vastly different, featuring George Harrison playing sitar. He had introduced the instrument on the Rubber Soul track Norwegian Wood.
I kept hearing the name of Ravi Shankar. It felt very familiar to me to listen to that music.
His interest in Indian music would bring the genre into Western households. When the Beatles stopped touring and took a break, George traveled to India to study with Shankar and became enamored with Eastern philosophy. You can hear George's Indian textures all throughout the Beatles' compositions, especially his lone composition on Sgt. Pepper, Within You, Without You, although only a northern song was also recorded during these sessions. In fact, with the exception of A Day in the Life, I think Within You, Without You might be my favorite track on this record. It's very hypnotic. The lyrics allude to Eastern philosophies and his experiences with LSD. That instrumental break bridging the Indian musicians with Western musicians is such a sublime performance. He recorded one more Indian-inspired composition for the group, The Inner Light, which ended up being the B-side to Lady Madonna, the first time one of George's songs was the flip side. Around this time, George's interest in the Beatles was starting to wane. So in 1968, he released his first solo album, the first solo album by any of the Beatles, Wonderwall Music. And yes, this is where Oasis got the title for their song. The album was a soundtrack for the film of the same name. Something about a scientist and a model named Penny Lane. I don't know, I didn't really watch the whole film. It's some 60s experimental acid trip. As for the soundtrack, it's mostly an excuse for George to experiment with different Indian sounds. The most famous track might be Skiing, which featured Eric Clapton on guitar, their first collaboration together. The real reason I'm not including it with the other solo album reviews is it's just not a commercial pop album. It's a soundtrack, and an experimental one at that. Still, I will admit it is an interesting listen, and if you're interested in George's journey into Indian music, you might get some enjoyment out of Wonderwall Music, but honestly, it doesn't do that much for me. And after the release of this album, it kind of ended George's Indian music studies, and he went back to writing guitar-based songs. You can hear him replicating some Jimi Hendrix-style feedback on the LSD-inspired track from Yellow Submarine, It's All Too Much. Pretty wild track. The White Album featured 4 of George's compositions, more than any other Beatles album, but it was also recorded under pretty turbulent conditions. These included the social commentary Piggies, the R&B inspired Savoy Trefoil, the softer Long Long Lawn, and of course While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Written following the band's meditation retreat where George found himself further isolated from Lennon and McCartney. It didn't help that neither of them were taking his compositions very seriously at this time, nor was producer George Martin.
I brought Eric Clapton in to play on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. Suddenly everybody's on their best behavior.
Eric Clapton's solo on Weeps is often considered to be the greatest guitar solo of all time, and it's easy to see why. It just complements the theme of the song so perfectly. Every time I played the solo in Let It Be, it brought the house down. It's that powerful of a tune. A little side note, George collaborated with Eric on the song Badge for Cream's Goodbye album, one of their finest tracks thanks to that wonderful bridge guitar riff played by George himself.
I just spent like the last 6 months producing an album of this fella Jackie Lomax and hanging out with Bob Dylan and the band in Woodstock and having a great time.
In fact, he and Bob started collaborating together as Bob was eager to learn some more interesting chord patterns. And together they wrote I'd Have You Any Time, which would eventually be the lead-off track to All Things Must Pass. We'll talk about that later. During Let It Be, George auditioned a ton of new tunes, many of which would be on All Things Must Pass, including Let It Down, Hear Me Lord, Isn't It a Pity, even the title track itself. In fact, there's a few bootleg recordings of them rehearsing the song, some of which sound pretty good.
All things must pass away.
Ultimately, though, George was met with the same disinterest from his bandmates. The film is famous for showing the band breaking up.
Yeah, okay, well, I don't mind. I'll play, whatever you want me to play.
You can see George, Paul, and Ringo rehearsing the song I Me Mine, a comment on the studio vibe, while John decided to waltz with Yoko. According to him, waltzes weren't rock and roll. Never mind the fact that John had already written a number of waltzes for the Beatles, including Dig a Pony, which was recorded during the same session, but, he was on heroin. What do you expect? In fact, the only reason the song made it to Let It Be was because director Michael Lindsay Hogg wanted to include the footage of John and Yoko dancing. I Me Mine would later be their last recording session together as a band in January 1970 without John's involvement. So in the middle of the Let It Be project, George left the band.
So I got my guitar and I just went home and wrote Wah Wah.
He was coaxed to come back and finish the record, and they managed to include George's bluesy love letter to wife Pattie Boyd, For You Blue.
'Cause you're sweet and lovely, girl. I love you.
George was also responsible for bringing Billy Preston into the sessions to lighten the mood, and would later produce Billy's first album for the Apple label. In April, he tracked the song Old Brown Shoe as the B-side to The Ballad of John and Yoko, which I'm not a huge fan of. Between albums, George found himself interested in the new Moog synthesizer and put out his second experimental LP called Electronic Sound. And if you thought Wonderwall music was too esoteric to listen to, you're not going to like this one. What is essentially a test of the Moog sounds, it's practically unlistenable unless you're interested in the history of the instrument. It's another album that's not even worth including on the list. However, he did incorporate the instrument to much better effect on Abbey Road. You can hear it on Maxwell's Silver Hammer, Because, and even the wind sounds at the end of She's So Heavy. And while recording this record, the magic seemed to return, and George recorded two of his best-known compositions. The first was the classic Something, which proved George Harrison was no longer the songwriting underdog of the Beatles.
Something in the way she moves me.
This time George played the guitar solo himself, and it's one of my favorites. It ended up sharing the A-side with the single Come Together, and even Frank Sinatra famously called it the greatest Lennon-McCartney song ever written. Well, if Frank Sinatra says it, then it must be true. Here Comes the Sun kicked off side 2, which George wrote at Eric Clapton's house walking around the garden.
It was one of those beautiful spring mornings. We were just walking around the garden with our guitars, and he started to sing. Started to sing Here Comes the Sun, and I just watched this thing come to life.
In what must have been a difficult period, this track is just so uplifting. It's like a perfect 3 minutes of pop music with Harrison's Indian influence sprinkled throughout. To this day, Here Comes the Sun is the most streamed Beatles song and most downloaded as well, more than Hey Jude or Twist and Shout. That's pretty amazing. I have pretty vivid memories of my parents playing Here Comes the Sun in the car's tape deck of all things while driving me to school. And even though I played it countless times with Let It Be, it's still a very special tune to perform.
It's alright.
At the point we'd finished Abbey Road, it was really, the game was up, and I think we all accepted that.
At the time the Beatles broke up, George Harrison had a huge stockpile of tunes. Adding to that pile when he briefly toured with Delaney and Boddy and Friends, which included Eric Clapton, Bobby Whitlock, and several musicians who he'd come to collaborate with in the next decade. And that sets the stage for the first album review in the series. I'll see you all then.